Yep. Yeah. That's okay. Well, would anybody be willing to start us off with a prayer? We don't need fancy prayers here, just prayer.
I will.
Thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, we just come to you this evening to listen to what you would have us to learn. It's nice that we can be here. It's nice that we have friends to visit with, and we are so thankful for Daniel and Catherine that have come to our church and are leading us in the ways that you would have us go. We just thank you for this group of people, and please just help us to be mindful of everyone. We ask these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. See who we've got coming in. Hey, there they are.
Here comes the Brayman bunch.
Well, you guys are just in time. We were just eager. Good.
Well, I took her on a little detour.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I'll sit on the high chair tonight. Brother Chris
You sit with the big people.
Yeah.
Now, if he tells me he couldn't come to the Super Bowl, I'm gonna give him trouble.
It doesn't start till 5 or 5:30.
That's-
so there was no
5:30.
reason.
That's what we all agreed on. That's what we all
5:30
agreed.
good. I'll
So
be
everybody, next time you see Chris, you give him trouble because you
No,
know
we
he'd do
will.
the same to you.
Oh, absolutely.
home. Not him.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, we this week I asked you to read chapters 1 through 11 for two purposes. I very much doubt we're going to be able to discuss much of the stuff in that. You know, I'm sure you guys within 5 minutes are going to hit me with a question hard enough to take us the whole time. But it's really good to read and reread and reread. You notice things over, and so we'll get through as much as we can. Now, one place I'd like to start, just because these are such foundational stories for us, are chapters 2 and 3, the story of the Garden of Eden. We're all very familiar, and yet, actually, if you're paying attention while you're reading, you'll notice there are all kinds of things most of us struggle to understand, all kinds of questions that pop up. And so, just to start us off, was there anything in your reading this week that popped out to you, anything that you wanted to ask or talk about with us from the story of the Garden of Eden? I'll give you a second to refresh yourself.
Why was Eve the first one to take the apple?
That's a good question. And lots of different people with different answers. I mean, have any of y'all heard a good answer for that question? Well, the first answer that's probably important, the most important one to give, is we don't really know. A lot of our why questions in life and in the Bible, often there's not a clear answer. And so a part of being a good student of the Bible is saying, does the Bible itself provide an answer to the question? Sometimes there's a clear answer to that, and you can say, yes, the Bible does tell me. You know, there's the because right there, because this. Sometimes you have to really study, and then as you study it, you start to see kind of answers emerge to your question. And sometimes you just have to shrug and say, maybe God will tell us afterwards. So here's some guesses. God created Adam and then Eve in this story, right? God gave the commandment not to eat of the fruit of the tree to Adam. Now, we don't know. Perhaps God also gave the commandment to Eve when he created her. Some people have guessed that what's implied in the story is that Adam is supposed to teach Eve. Adam is supposed to share with her what Yahweh has said. So some people have reasoned that perhaps Adam didn't do a good job teaching Eve. Now, you notice, does Eve know the commandment to not eat from that fruit? Hey, Ruth.
Hello.
She does know the commandment. Did you notice any differences between what God told Adam and what God told Eve? Let's see if we can find it really quickly. Okay, so to Adam, in verse 16 of chapter 2, he says, You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. Then, if you look at chapter 3, verse 2, when the woman is responding to the snake, she says, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.
Now, mine reads,
Mhm.
the woman answered the snake, we may not eat the fruit from the tree in the garden, but God told, we may eat, that God told us in mine on the very first thing in chapter 3, or verse 3, that God told us, this one says.
Okay, so that is a little bit different. So in mine he just said, but God said, in hers it says, but God told us. So that kind of makes it sound like maybe God did tell Eve directly. Okay, interesting.
You can take it that way, but if he told Adam and Adam told Eve, why, that's an us, isn't it?
Sure. So maybe that's kind of just summing it up. Like Adam told her, but if Adam told her, and those are the words of God, then God told us. So either he told her directly or he told her through Adam. Either way, God told him. But did you notice the main difference between what God tells Adam and what Eve says?
Eve says you can't touch it.
Yeah. She adds something. You can't touch it.
She also said it was in the
that? I
center.
missed that.
of the
They
garden.
Yes,
not
that's
eat
good.
Or even touch it lest you die.
Chapter
Chapter 3.
verse 3. Verse
Oh.
3.
But that's what he told Adam.
Well, he told Adam that you shall not eat of it, but he didn't say you may not touch it. To Adam, he didn't mention anything about touching it.
That's true. He didn't.
But Pam pointed out another good thing. To Adam, he doesn't specify that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is in the middle of the garden or in the midst of the garden. But Eve, she says in the midst of the garden. So, right, and these are really important. When the authors of the Bible wrote their books, the various authors, different books, none of it is haphazard. None of it is just like, oh, I just thought I'd introduce this little detail. Writing was expensive. Parchment was expensive. Well, here at this point, they're writing, the Torah was mostly wrote on, help me out, what's the name of that? A scroll, which was not papyrus. That was later. This is written on animal skins. Just trying to remember what animal skins are called. A Torah is always written on animal skins, even to this day, I think, if it's a proper Torah, which is, remember, the first 5 books of the Bible. So, you needed a professional because most people couldn't write. Most people couldn't read. And they had to be trained to write correctly in order to put in all the right things. And you had to know how to space everything out just right so it looked even, and you got as much on the page as possible or on the scroll. And so you needed a trained person who knew how to write. And then the scroll itself was super expensive. And normally you only had one for an entire community. So these stories, it's not like today where just for funsies you put in a little extra sentence and it's like, oh, there's a little flourish, there's a little flourish. It is all intentional and it's all inspired by God. So when you notice these little differences, it's really important because often the author's trying to point out things to you. And so now, in the midst of the garden could just be kind of a simple thing where she's just including something about its location. It's in the middle of the garden. So many depictions of the Garden of Eden have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the middle. And you can imagine that would make it a little bit more tempting. You're probably going to see it from more places. You might come across, oh, he did come.
And I got his chair.
Hey, Chris, welcome.
I
Hey.
wish you wouldn't have.
Naps on Sunday are holy too. Just not during the sermon.
That's simple.
Yeah, right. So, but the other thing, where she just adds, "You shall not touch it." We don't know where that came from. It could be that have you ever? I've only seen this a little bit, but have you ever asked a kid what their parents told them to do, and they make up stuff? Mm-hmm. They'd be like, my mom told me not to eat a cookie and not to put it up my nose. Or, something ridiculous. And you're like, what? Your mom didn't tell you that, I heard your mom tell you what to do. You just made that up. it almost strikes me a little bit like a little kid. Like maybe she just kind of added that in. She got the impression, do not mess with that tree. Or maybe Adam, in transferring the message from God, like to make it that clear to her, said, and don't you even touch it. And she took that as Adam's command. Or, or God said it to her. We don't know why she inserted that extra thing. But there's this fascinating concept in, I think it's in the Midrash, in Jewish tradition, that's called putting a fence around the Torah. So there's this long tradition in Judaism that in order to make sure that people never break God's laws, they introduce more guidelines, more rules to keep people even further away from breaking God's laws. So it's like, here's the rule that God gave, don't do that. Okay, now we're going to tell people, to not even go into town on that day, so they don't even get close to selling on the Sabbath, or don't even pick up a mat on that day, because often when people pick up their mats, then they go and they break the Sabbath in some way. So you kind of put a rule out in front of the rule to keep you further away from it. And they called that keep putting a fence around the Torah. And I remember a professor pointing out that this might be an early instance of that kind of, it's something we might do with our own kids. You might give them some extra instructions to keep them from getting too close to something dangerous, and really give them an impression that it's stay away. But I guess part of this is all just worth asking ourselves for the purpose of saying, we're not sure exactly how Eve learned about whether or not to touch a tree. And it could be that something about the process of either getting it through Adam or something is that that could be a part of our answer for why she ate the fruit of the tree. Why it was her. And something that's kind of dangerous to say, but I feel like I have to say, is that there is a theme within the Bible of women's power over men. There are a lot of stories of women's ability to influence men to do things, which is not necessarily, it doesn't have to go a sexist direction. It's just a realistic description of what every man knows.
Been going on for 2,000 years.
That every man knows that women have power over them. And it's a different kind of power. Men have their own power.
And you had to go and tell that, right? You had to remind
Right.
people.
Yeah.
I tell people I'm the head of the family and she's the neck.
Yes.
The neck turns the head.
I know. I've heard that one a number of times. I think it was Kent
From
Bush who
him.
said that in my hearing the first time. And so, so this is actually a repeated theme. You can find many stories of a man who is led to do either good or evil through the influence of a woman, all throughout the Bible. And the one of the hot spots of this is actually in Proverbs, where you have Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. And they're both on like corners beckoning to people to come into their house. But they do it differently, and the results are different. The one who answers the call of Lady Folly ends up in ruin and destruction. The one who answers the call of Lady Wisdom comes into life, abundant life. So, if anything, the Bible tells a story of women have this amazing power and ability to influence men for good and for evil. And so hear the call again, women, to be holy influences on the men around you in your life, because we need you to help us direct us to God. But maybe that's a part of why, from the beginning, women had an amazing ability to draw men in certain directions. So Adam knew the commandment. Arguably, he got it most directly, and yet he broke it in order to listen to the voice of his wife more than the voice of God. In fact, right before today's story that I preached on with Jacob and Esau, in the whole story of their blessing, there's a theme. Rebecca, Jacob's mother, 3 times says, "Obey my voice." Obey my voice. Until then, in Genesis, the only time you hear the idea of obeying or obeying the voice, it's in relation to God. And so it leaves you with this question. Is this a good thing? Like, is she a stand-in for God and she's helping Jacob to go in a good direction? Or is this kind of not good because she's helping him to be deceptive? And honestly, I don't really know what's going on. It's really fascinating if you pay attention in that story. Isaac, the father, blesses, and he speaks the words that God spoke to Abraham. He says, cursed is anyone who curses you, blessed is anyone who blesses you. That's what God said to Abraham. So I kind of see in the story that the parents are taking on kind of the role of God. They're instructing Jacob in the ways that God had instructed them. But the question is, are they doing it in the right way? I mean, it's mysterious. But to me, it's clear that because she says that 3 times throughout the text, and anytime you see something repeated in the Bible, it's normally a flag. Hey, pay attention to this. That the story's trying to let you know, hey, is it a good thing that he's obeying the voice of his mother right now? It's a good question.
Maybe that's why the snake approached Eve in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he'd approached Adam, we all know men tend to think more linearly,
Mm-hmm.
like black and white,
Mm-hmm.
yes or no. If he'd approached Adam and he just said no, I mean, maybe he had approached Adam.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know.
Yeah.
And he said no.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what we're doing. And so, he tempted.
Mm-hmm.
He approached Eve.
Mm-hmm. And in a way, it could have been very insidious. Satan knew how to get to Adam. If I want to get to Adam, I'm going to have to go through Eve.
Right.
Adam was there.
Yeah.
He was there. He saw it all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's clear that he was there when she was tempted.
Yeah.
And so...
And he didn't stop her.
Right. And so there are some people who take this as a clear indication... So some people, and this is where I could get in trouble, but, there's this classic debate within the church of complementarianism and egalitarianism. Within marriage, is the man supposed to be the spiritual head of the family, or is that kind of an old-fashioned idea? And we could get stuck there, but I don't necessarily, but part of this is to let you be acquainted with how people talk about this. Complementarians will often point back to this passage and say, it was Adam's responsibility to not only obey God, but to make sure that Eve did. And when he doesn't step in this moment, when he's there, he's failing his role to be the head of his family. And so often in the telling, Eve gets stuck with the blame, right? We talk about, now, unless you listen to Paul, if you read Romans, Paul talks all about how Adam was the sinner, but there are other parts of the Bible that lay the blame with Eve. But complementarians often will be the first to say, actually, the real problem was with Adam, who didn't carry his responsibility well.
And we know he was there at the same time.
Well, it's kind of implied by how the story is told, because she hands the fruit to him.
Okay.
I guess theoretically, he could have just come up right after she ate the fruit, and she was like, here, have this. And he was like, what? Okay. But
Not knowing where it came from.
But she would have been at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, so he would have known. Another really interesting thought is, and I learned this from this Bible Project. I send you videos sometimes from this organization called the Bible Project, and they make these really great videos. And they've talked about how in Hebrew, the words for good and evil, it's actually would be better to say good and bad, because the word in Hebrew for that we translate as evil is the word ra, and it's often used for anything that is like not just morally evil. When we think about evil, we think about morality, right? But ra is anything that is bad, anything that kind of is ill fortune. If a storm were to happen, it would be called a ra storm or something like that. Or, if someone lost a son, it would be called ra. It wouldn't mean it was morally evil that they lost a son. It was just bad or something like that. And so it is morally wrong for them to take from that tree. But part of the idea of taking from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that it introduces not just evil into the world, but bad things. Not just moral evil, but like things fall apart because of that. And sometimes things fall apart, and it's not a question of morality. It's just a question of not God's intention. You know what I'm saying? Let's see, is there anything else that we really want to discuss? I have a few things I'd like to point out, but from chapters 2 and 3, or any questions that occurred to you?
Would it also point out, though, that humans are, they follow the law? I mean, they fall. They do things that's wrong.
Sure.
I mean, that's just human.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it became what is human after the fall. That was not God's original intention. God's intention for humanity at least as we assume from what the text kind of implies, is that we would always be with him, always listening to him, always obeying him, and that we theoretically didn't have to go down this long road away from God, and we wouldn't have had to fight. But the immediate consequence of rebelling was that we started fighting with each other. And ever since, that's been the human story. So it's not, when you talk about what it means to be human, you have to make sure that you keep in your mind that distinction. Human as we find ourselves now, and human as God designed us to be. Because God designed us in his image to be, remember his priestly kings, his royal priests, people having authority over earth, representing him in creation and ruling on his behalf as good, wise rulers obedient to him, as priests blessing everything in his name and carrying the needs of creation to God. But we rebelled. So true humanity is what God wanted, what he intended, what he created us for. And now we are something less than human, in a sense. We are marred humans, twisted humans. In the language of C.S. Lewis in his Space Trilogy, we are bent now. And so what part of the story with Jesus is that in Jesus, we are restored to true humanity as God intended us to be.
Except we're still bent. A little bit.
Yeah, and that is a concept.
Fight against being bent.
Yeah, so there is there's a couple different terms here. One is what we call the already not yet. Christians are stuck in we're already saved and sanctified and freed from sin. But we're also not yet fully saved and sanctified and freed from sin. Jesus is already king over all creation. And yet he's not fully king. Not all things are under his feet yet. So Christians live in this in-between space of already not yet, waiting eagerly for the completion, the fulfillment of all those things.
So where did all the people come from in this world that are not Christians and don't want to be Christian and all that?
Well,
All the beginning and stuff.
Well,
Where did they come from?
Well, there's a couple of different options for the answer to your question. One we may talk about more in future weeks, which is, you get outside of the garden, and the way that the Eden story is told, the only humans are Adam and Eve and then their children. But then their children have wives. Cain finds a wife, and then their son Seth finds a wife, and you have to say, well, where did the wives come from? There are no other women except for Eve on earth, right? So some people have thought for thousands of years now that perhaps there were other humans outside of the garden. Some people have thought that the Genesis 1 account of creation and the Genesis 2 and 3 account of creation are actually not fully separate creation stories, but that what we're hearing in the first account is a creation of a larger humanity, and what we're hearing in 2 and 3 is like a specific humanity that God is giving a specific purpose. And I mean, that rabbit hole goes deep, and I'm not qualified. I haven't researched that a lot.
So that would be where the dinosaurs came in. Been bothering me for 2 weeks. And through all of this, when did the dinosaurs come and the cavemen?
Yeah, so, and this is, again, where you kind of fall into different camps. There are some people who read Genesis 1 and 2 as camera footage of exactly how it happened, in the order it happened, and in the time it says. So there are 6-day creationists who say it happened in 6 days, 6 24-hour days. And if you think anything less, you're not a Christian, and you don't believe the Bible. Most people aren't there. Some people say each day is 1,000 years, because in another place it says, to the Lord, 1,000 years are 1 day, and a day is 1,000 years. And so they take that very literally. It's a different kind of literalism where they say, okay, so 6 days was 6,000 years then. And then there are other people who say, no, time is relative in a sense. Time to us humans is very different to how time is to God. And the days are not so much there to tell you a 24-hour day as to tell you in distinct increments of time, that in an orderly process, God created one thing after the other and created the habitats and then put the inhabitants in it. And so I think it's possible to believe that the creation is very old and that there were such things as dinosaurs, And now when exactly they were made, I don't know. And honestly, it's not in here. And that doesn't bother me a whole lot. And it's okay if that does bother you, and if you're clear that there can have been dinosaurs. I think we can still be Christian brothers and sisters and, commune with each other and pray for each other. But as far as I'm concerned, Genesis 1 isn't trying to tell us of everything that was created and exactly when it was created. It's trying to give us the idea of, first God created this habitat, and then he put these animals over here, and then he put these animals over here. And we're just supposed to assume anything that's not listed there, any land animal, God created, and he put on land at different times. Anybody want to give a different perspective or say why you think my answer is problematic?
I wish I was smart enough to. Anybody watching Shepherd's Chapel on TV with Arnold Meyer? He's just a Bible scholar, and him and his brother both take turns speaking. And if you pick it up on DirecTV, I watched him several times, and he's just a one man reading through the Bible, one verse for one verse. Anyway, his explanation of, and he speaks pretty. Adam is Adam.
Mm-hmm.
It's people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not one people, it's people.
Yeah, humanity.
Yeah, humanity. So he created Adam and spread them throughout the world. And so his explanation of the Garden of Eden is, I don't know, kind of in between where you're at there, that it did happen. I've also have seen, and I tried to find it in the footnotes, in the beginning God created heavens and earth, and there was chaos, but that isn't the way this reads. In my other Bible it was. And that chaos.
Oh, yeah. They're translating.
Chapter 1.
Yeah, they're translating verse.
That includes the many of years that that happened prior to the Garden of Eden.
I think it's a great way of reading it. Is saying that time when the earth was shapeless and void, formless and void, and there was an abyss. The abyss is supposed to. They translated the abyss as chaos because that's how the ancient world understood it. Thank you, Chris. You just reminded me of some really great things. So I think that's a great way of interpreting it. That time is not measured. I mean, even if you look at like the modern theory of the Big Bang, and it took 14 point some billion years for the creation to take place, that's a pretty chaotic, and order does come out of that. So there are a lot of people who have no problem saying, yeah, sure, God, was the originator of the Big Bang, and all that long process over billions of years was God bringing order out of the chaos. So. Who am I to say I can't answer it definitively? God will answer us in the end. But another thing, Chris, that you said was really great. Both in chapter 1, in the first creation account, and in the second creation account, you have the word Adam. So in chapter 1, when he creates humanity, the word in Hebrew is Adam. And that word doesn't just reference one person, it can reference all of humanity. So in chapter 2, it's really clear from the narrative, it's referring to one person. But you can't get away from the fact that it also is this word that represents more people. Eve's name, do you know what that means?
Queen.
It actually means life. Life. And then it explains it afterwards when he names her. It's after the fall. Let's see. And it's after God kind of gives the consequences and the curses. The man called the wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Or what does yours say? The mother of all. Sorry, that's verse 20. Chapter 3, verse 20. The mother of all living.
Life-giving one.
The life-giving one.
Mm-hmm.
So Eve literally means life, and then it explains why she was called life. And it was because she is the mother of all that lives, all humanity that lives. Does that make sense? So some people have taken this as Eve is not necessarily, they'll go so far as to say, this isn't a historical account. This is a symbolic narrative meant to explain how we ended up in sin and death. And so these representative terms are used of Adam meaning humanity and Eve meaning life. And you just have all of these like really potent symbols. But that's, as far as I'm concerned, I have no problem believing that Adam and Eve were real historical humans. But also if someone were to say to me, for these 100 reasons, we can't believe that they were historical, literal people, I'd say, that still doesn't bother me. Like, it's still true. It's still true. So, but we don't have to get stuck there. A lot of people get stuck on, were these real people? Is this historical? And that's an important discussion. But the main point of this is, all of this is true. The story of how sin came into the world and of our rebellion against God through disobedience and unbelief is true. And God's judgments are true. How this reveals that God is a God of justice, and he's not going to deal with us rebelling against him and just, not do anything about it. Now, a couple of things. In chapter 2, verses 10 to 14, it goes through this like list of rivers, the 4 rivers. I didn't refresh myself on this, but a couple of these are rivers that we know the ancient world knew about. And I was looking to see if they're on this map. They're not. But I think like the Gihon, I can't remember where that flowed. I feel like maybe I remember reading that it was in Egypt. But some of these, we know, we have ancient records that these were real rivers, real names. A couple of them, I think at least 2 of them, we don't have any ancient records of anybody else ever referring to them. But that's all I can really say about it. But one thing I will say is this is maybe the first part of the Bible that really deals with geography. And geography is super important. I never paid attention to it for a long time, but the more you pay attention to it, the more you'll see connections pop up. Some of the story is told through geography and realizing, wait, Abraham was in this place, and then Isaac was in this place, and then Jacob was in this place. What? Why does that matter? Or a sacred place being in one place, or the fact that they're up on a mountain, or the fact that they're in a valley, or near a river, or in a desert, that is always important. And so if you pay attention to those details and try and remember the names of the places, that will really benefit you. Now notice that God is really generous. He puts them in a garden, and he says, you can eat all of these trees. All of them. And you might even assume, because he didn't tell them to not eat from the tree of life. Later on, after they've had from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he says, keep them away from the tree of life, because then they'll live forever. Before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God wasn't concerned about that. He said, eat from any tree. That could have included the tree of life. And in a sense, the fact that there's a tree of life and there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil implies that there was a choice from the beginning. That they could choose either eternal life or that they could choose to have their own wisdom. They could have their own knowledge of good and bad. And in a sense, take the authority for themselves. And, yeah, right. And some people, I don't know how much I put stock in this. Some people have said, what really happens when they eat from the knowledge of good and evil, tree of knowledge and good and bad, is they already knew good. They already knew God. And they could already eat all these delightful things, and they already knew God. What really happened when they ate the tree of good and bad is they were exposed to badness, evil. And now they were aware of all of the evil things that they could do, Which is
why you don't want them to live forever.
Right. So, some people have thought, why does God do this? Why does God put 2 trees there? Why is there a choice? Or why does God not let them eat from the tree of life? Why wouldn't he want them to live forever? One answer to that is God did not want a bunch of fools who were choosing evil to live forever. Thank the Lord. Because if people choosing sin and evil could live for forever, it would not be a good story. Now, the next thing, and this one, I'm just going to say a quick note, and I don't really know what to do with it. Adam names all the animals, right? there's more significance here than what I understand, because names are really important in Genesis. You know, at the Tower of Babel, they want to make a great name for themselves. Then God promises Abram he will make his name great. Then he changes Abraham's name. Then he changes Sarai's name. Then he changes Jacob's name. Names are a big deal. If you pay attention just to the word name, it comes up a lot. And so the fact that Adam is naming things is indicative. I mean, I think at the very least we can say it's a sign of his authority. God is sharing his rulership with Adam and saying, look, this creation is under your dominion. So name these things.
You know, we still do that today. They find a new star out there, somebody gets to name it. It's
Yeah.
a big deal.
Yeah.
They get to name it.
And you name your child.
Yeah. Couldn't care less about that.
You don't want to name some random island that someone just found? Oh, okay. But you name your child, and I haven't had that joy yet, but I can imagine what a thing that is to name your own child. And
Something to argue about for a while.
yeah. Well, imagine at this point, Adam apparently didn't.
You do it before you take them out of the hospital.
Well, and here Adam's naming animals. It's not his own children, and Eve's not around yet, so I'm sure it was a little easier. But, because they couldn't argue about it. Now, notice that here we have our first description of marriage, right? Now, with taking of the rib, I'm no expert on this, and there are different explanations. Some people say, the ancient translation, or ancient, the classic translation is referring to a rib. Some people, I remember earlier in my life hearing that it was like his rib cage, like one half of his rib cage. The Bible Project will say literally that they took half of Adam and made it into an Eve, and basically split him down the middle kind of thing, and it became two people. I'm no expert. The point is, a substantial part of Adam is taken away to create another human being, Eve. And in marriage, they become one flesh, which is a very strong image of unity, right? And this is really important for us when we talk about marriage today, because the Bible teaches and talks about marriage in a way that it's supposed to be permanent. When Jesus is asked by the Pharisees about divorce, he quotes this very verse, and he says, "Did not Moses teach you that a man shall leave his house and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? Let no man tear asunder what God has joined together." And the idea is that this is they have become one. And that is already, from page 2 of the Bible, countercultural. Because these days, marriage is just a contract, and if it doesn't work out, a lot of people are, I tried, so now I'm out. Which, I know there are other stories where there's abuse, there's really legitimate reasons that occasionally people get divorced. But we also know that divorce is a much bigger problem than it's supposed to be, and that many more people take an easier out than should be the case if they're one flesh.
Well, I think the truth of the matter is, no matter how much you want out, maybe you both want out, maybe there's all kinds of good reasons to get out, it's still painful because you are tearing that flesh.
Right. Yeah. And I really do think, here's where I'm happy to get spiritual. I really do think that when you get married, you become one in a way that is also not something that we're always clearly aware of. I feel much more bound to Catherine now after marriage than I ever did before. And I really do feel like a big part of me is far away, and I like it.
Yeah.
Wait till you've been married 40 years.
Yeah. And then I'll feel different.
Don't you have a trip to go on?
Then
Uh-huh.
you need a vacation.
Uh-huh. All right, we'll check in then. But, so this is what is really important when the New Testament talks about the church being the bride of Christ. This makes sense of, in my mind, growing up, there were these separate images. The church was compared to a building, or the church was compared to a bride, or the church was compared to a body. And that makes sense. I mean, you can't really make the building analogy be the bride analogy. They're kind of separate pictures. But it was like two things really clicked for me when I realized when the church is called Jesus's body, I think, and I could be wrong about this actually, I shouldn't say it too confidently, but I think that that's meant to be joined with the image of being Christ's bride. Because actually, throughout in the Hebrew language and in the Old Testament, the idea is that you're one flesh. That's my flesh that I've been joined to. That's my body. And here, when Adam sees Eve, he says, "This is bones of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This is my own body. This is my own flesh." So that in Ephesians 5, when Paul talks about how the husband is called to love his wife as his own body, he's drawing on that Jewish way of thinking about marriage as one flesh, this is my body. And in a way, it's this beautiful idea of like what was separated is being joined together. In a sense, I think it explains most humans' feeling of not feeling complete until they get married. Feeling like we're really lacking something. And it's kind of like, I'm missing like half of my rib cage here. I need something right. I feel this really big weak spot. And then you get married and you're like, okay, I got a few more ribs. Like, I can walk through this world now. Ideally, is I guess what marriage should be. But I think that it's really important for us when we're reading the New Testament in the language of the bride to realize that the church really is like, we belong to Jesus. We're his own body. And he's our head, and we're one with him. We're called to be one with Jesus, our head. And that's the language of marriage. Does that make sense? How I'm trying to help us connect those two images of body and marriage. Okay. I'll also point out, ancient Israel was a patriarchal society. And today that word has gotten a really negative connotation in our society, which some of that, we won't get into that. Because what's going on here is more a statement of fact that the society was very much built around tracing lineage through men's lines, of men being the head of the household. But we have to really be careful to not hear that and think of 1940s America, where the woman is like constricted to her house. Women were also pretty powerful back in ancient Israel, or in the time of Jesus. You had women who were, Lydia was a trader of purple, I think. And that was like a super expensive, she was probably rich. She was a businesswoman. They met in houses owned by women. Many of the women of the early church were the reason why the church could meet in houses, often rich women. In Proverbs 31, the classic text to describe the ideal woman, she's described as having strong arms and being a good businesswoman who provides for her family. She's not some dainty housewife who never gets outside the house and her husband walks in and says, "Where's my sandwich?" So I think part of that, I don't anticipate people here, having a red, alarm go off when they hear the word patriarchal. But in this society, the man is the head of the family, and they have separate roles in society, and they're both very important separate roles in society. But when you got married, it was traditional in ancient societies across the board, I think, except for your rare exception, for the woman to leave her house and to go be joined to the man's house. The way that it was in ancient Israel, you had in what was Hebrew called a bet-ab, the household, and you had a patriarch at the head of it. And that included everybody that was included in his household was like his children, sometimes his grandchildren, slaves. It was actually pretty sprawling. It was basically the extended family. Eventually, when someone got married, they would go off to start their own bet-ab. And that would kind of result in another kind of branch of this tree. We have a much more you just have your parents, you have the nuclear family, and then you branch off and you go start your own family. But there, it was much more expansive. And so it was, in most ancient societies, it was common that a woman would have been in her her father's or perhaps even her grandfather's or sometimes her brother's household, and he was responsible for taking care of her and marrying her off. And when she got married, she would leave that household and be under the care of another man. And that's why later in the biblical story, if you meet a woman who's a widow, she's in a bad position often. If she doesn't have a male relative, she doesn't have anyone to provide for her. That's why the story of Ruth is this beautiful story of faithfulness, and basically Ruth saying, I'll die with you. You know, like, I won't go find a husband for myself. I'll risk dying and going to a foreign people who probably won't like me. And that's why it's a big deal that in the early church, Jesus made sure that widows, Paul gave a lot of instructions for taking care of widows, because if they didn't have any relatives, they were in big trouble. So it's really interesting. You notice that here in Genesis, it actually says the opposite. It says the man will leave his household and be joined to his wife. I don't even know what to do with that. Do you know what to do with that?
Well, they'll just live separately and have their own house.
Okay, so maybe that's just saying he will leave his own household and not be joined into her household, but they will start their own household. You know what? That is a really simple way of putting it.
That's the only logic there is.
Well, no, here's the reason why I'm confused, and I'm wondering if there would be a response back to Rita's answer, was because in one of the books I read, they said, well, this is already a countercultural thing at this point, because the woman isn't, having to go into the vulnerable position of leaving her house. The man is having to leave his house. And so it's kind of like reversing the vulnerable question. And because it is clear that in a number of ways, the Bible does challenge things that were very normal in that world at that time. And I'll point out more of those as we go along. So in some ways, the Bible was countercultural. And there are people out there who are looking for every one of those countercultural things. Whether this is a good example, I don't know. But I think that could be a really simple answer to this question, Rita.
To me, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay. All right.
I agree with you, Rita.
All right. You and Chris are a team. You win. One thing I want to point out to you, verse 5 of chapter, we need to talk about the serpent. What is this serpent? Is it just a normal serpent? Just turns out back then snakes could talk.
Something that crawls on its belly.
Uh-huh.
It is not pleasant.
Satan, because they said Satan is a serpent.
Yeah. Okay. Terry says it could be Satan.
I always thought it was.
Is everybody clear it's Satan? Well, I think you're right.
You're right.
Well, the thing is, whether in the Old Testament, like Old Testament times, if you talk to an ancient Jew, I'm not sure what they would have said, if they would have had clarity that this was Satan. Now, by the time of the New Testament, when Revelation was written, they had clarity. If you read Revelation, it talks about Satan, and it says that ancient serpent, the dragon, and so it's clear that Revelation assumes that this is Satan here, or the devil. So the ancient world didn't just assume that there were talking snakes at some point and then they just stopped.
Why would a snake want to deceive them? Why would a snake care whether they...
Right, a normal snake. Yeah.
Why would a snake care?
Right.
There has to be another that wants an authority.
Yeah. And so most people of the ancient world, if they had read the story and they read about a snake talking, they would have been like, there's some spiritual mumbo jumbo going. There's some spiritual stuff going on here. This is not good. This is weird. And there are lots of theories about why a snake, or like, did the snake have little arms? Like it's always been kind of like a lizard. Was he kind of like a lizard at first, and then because he's told to crawl on his belly afterward. Now, one interesting thing that I heard that I think is true, and I can show you at one point, the Hebrew word for seraphim, you remember that word? There's some descriptions in the Bible of seraphim around God's throne, is related to another Hebrew word for snake. And one theory is that, in common popular Christianity, people will talk about Satan as just a fallen angel. The seraphim had a unique role, and we have to realize that in the heavens, it's not just God and angels. there are other spiritual creatures, including the cherubim and seraphim. And I think some people hold that the cherubim and seraphim are separate names for the same thing. But what I've been taught, and I think makes a lot of sense, is that seraphim at a certain point would have been understood as like these kind of serpentine kind of figures that were like guardians around God's throne. And so what Satan is depicted as here is a rebellious, like, throne guard of God's. Like, he had high authority in God's heavens, and then he did rebel. Either way, what you have to, I mean, if you're kind of buying into the worldview of the Bible early on, if God is the God of gods, and he created the heavens and the earth, he's the top spiritual being. You know, he's the God of gods, the King of kings, Lord of lords. So if you have a spiritual being that's doing something in opposition to God, this is clearly somebody in the heavens who is rebelling against God. And, you know, it makes a lot of sense to think of somebody being kind of high up in the chain of authority in the heavens being rebellious, because Satan seems to have a lot of power in the biblical story. But that makes a little bit more sense of why a snake. You know, why would it be a snake? Well, maybe because he was a seraph, and seraphs were kind of these serpentine spiritual figures. I'll probably send you an email with a link to a video that depicts this in, I think, kind of a fun way. So one way that I've heard this talk about is that from the beginning, the issue is not just a human rebellion. It's also a spiritual rebellion. You have, before the humans rebel, you have a spiritual being who's acting against God, right? So the heavens, beings in the heavens are rebelling against God, and then humans rebel. And it's basically like the heavens and the earth are against God, rebelling against God after Genesis 3. And we'll find other traces of this spiritual rebellion through the story that I'll point out as we go, but it's something we don't normally notice. Now, if you look at verse 5, he says, the serpent says, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." I just want to point out, I want you guys to notice when there's language of seeing in the book of Genesis. Seeing. It's really important actually through much of the Old Testament. You might imagine, like, we're all aware that we talk about having eyes of faith, or like, you know, the spiritual world is invisible, or, you know, like, don't believe, you know, don't judge by appearances, kinds of truisms in our faith. All of that has its roots in Genesis with the language of seeing. So, you know, here he talks about eyes being opened, but then look at verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and here the word good, tov, can be understood as good or beautiful, good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes. See all the seeing language? And that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. She took the fruit and ate. She took the fruit. And so this is another thing. If you pay attention in Genesis, there will be a few more stories where someone sees something and then takes it. And that's normally indications that there's a test going on. And it's bad when someone takes something that God hasn't given. Okay? One famous story I've told you about before is David and Bathsheba. He sees Bathsheba, that she is good or beautiful, and then he takes her. And there are other stories where that happens. So just pay attention to that language. What do you think it was like when God was walking in the garden? Do you think they literally saw God walking?
Did they say they heard him?
So, right? They heard the
Something about a breeze
moving about in the garden.
They heard the sound of the Lord.
They heard the sound of the Lord, and remember the Lord there, when it's all caps, means that's the word. The word for that is the tetragrammaton, the 4 letters, Yahweh. It's a stand-in for his name, Yahweh.
Before we leave the serpent,
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
can I, let me just read what my commentary says here.
Okay.
With no introduction, the serpent appeared in paradise. This is the first clue in Scripture of creation outside the one that Adam and Eve experienced. The serpent symbolizes something both fascinating and loathsome. Yet neither Adam nor Eve saw the danger embodied in the serpent. The Hebrew word for cunning sounds like the Hebrew word for naked.
Mm-hmm.
Adam and Eve were naked in innocence, and the serpent was crafty and sneaky. In Eve's innocence and naivete, she showed no surprise on hearing a strange voice from the snake. And then it speaks to, the snake says, hath God indeed said, and it says, note that the serpent did not use the divine name of Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
Just,
So he was with the dinosaurs and then came into it.
yeah.
Get Yeah, that is really helpful.
That is.
And
Well, we don't really have the same one. You have one like that.
Well, yeah, mine's blue.
gosh,
I've got scribbling in it.
so
For,
and that brings up another thing. In Hebrew, there are a couple different words for the word God that are translated into the word God in English. When we talk about the word God, especially if it's spelled uppercase G, that is, we think of monotheism, one God, there is no other. If you spell it lowercase g, it can mean gods, Roman gods, Greek gods, whatever. In Hebrew, the main word used for God is Elohim. And Elohim grammatically is a plural word. So there are times in the scriptures where it's used to refer to gods, like we would lowercase g, gods of the other nations or what have you. There's a time, you guys remember the story of King Saul, the first king. Samuel has died and he's about to go into battle, and he goes to the witch of Endor. And he asks her to bring Samuel back from the dead, and his ghost comes out of the ground. You guys know that story? His ghost comes out of the ground, and when he sees it in Hebrew, it's called an Elohim. So this word Elohim is more flexible than our word in English for God or gods. And it normally indicates some kind of spiritual being. Now, it gets kind of complicated how we know when it's referring to God. When it's referring to Yahweh, first of all, if they want to name Yahweh by name and make clear it's him, they'll say Yahweh or Lord in all caps. But grammatically speaking, in Hebrew, if you want to indicate God, you say Elohim, but then you conjugate the verb in the singular. So it'd be kind of like saying, no, it'd be like saying, so here's an English sentence with a plural noun and a plural verb. The children played, okay? That's not a good one because played can be used for singular and, let's see. Okay, so think about this. The children eat their snack. If it's plural, you say the children eat. That's how you conjugate the verb. If you're talking about one child, you say he eats his snack. You have to conjugate the verb differently for the singular. In Hebrew, there's a similar kind of thing. If it's a singular noun, you have to use a singular verb. If it's a plural noun, plural verb. But when you're talking about God, the God of gods, you say Elohim still, which is plural, but then you conjugate the verb in the singular. So it'd be like the children eats is what it would sound like, kind of. Elohim, and then you would say a singular verb. So there's this grammatical way in which you're reading the Hebrew, and when it says Elohim, you know, it's referring to the God of gods, the spiritual being who's above all the other spiritual beings. Does that make sense? And in the biblical worldview, one of the main problems is that the nations and so much of humanity has started worshiping lesser spiritual beings that they consider gods. So when we talk about monotheism today and we say there are no other gods, that's true and it's false. It's true in the sense that God is the God of gods. He's a king, and there's no one like him. And there's nobody, he's distinct, and nobody can be compared with him. But there are all kinds of other spiritual beings, and some of them who are in rebellion against God, and they're wicked, and God's going to destroy them. You all right? Yeah. So that's something that's important to know going forward, because these spiritual beings are going to creep in and out of the story. And then I wanted to point out Hearing is also really important. All throughout the Bible, seeing, hearing, it's almost always significant because the snake speaks and she listens to the snake and she obeys the snake, and that leads to her destruction. Adam listens to Eve, and I'm trying to think, do those words actually appear? So first of all, they hear the sound of the Lord walking in the garden. And then, in verse 10, Adam says, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid. Yeah, it doesn't use much more hearing language. But nevertheless, pay attention to hearing language because it is important, okay? Also, I just wanted to point out, Genesis 1 only uses the language of blessing. It never mentions any curse, right? In Genesis 1, in the creation, God blesses the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, and then he blesses humanity, and then he blesses the seventh day. 3 blessings. Here in the Eden story, there is no language of blessing. You could, I don't think it's a stretch to say Eden was clearly a blessed place. It was like paradise, right? Everything was fruitful, everything was wonderful. But upon eating the fruit, there are curses. And who is cursed? Who gets cursed in the story? And what?
The man, the woman, and the serpent.
Well, this is what's important. If you pay attention, the word cursed is only used in relation to the serpent and the ground. It doesn't say that God cursed man or woman. So, because of you've done this, cursed are you above all cattle and above all wild animals. And then in verse 17, he says to Adam, he's talking to Adam about the consequences of his actions. In verse 17, he says, because you have listened to the voice, you've listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Think about that. That's really interesting. God doesn't just curse Adam, even though he's the one that broke it. He actually curses the ground, which always kind of leaves me feeling like, well, dang, why'd the ground have to pay the price? Like, the ground didn't do anything wrong.
Basically, he's cursing Adam because he said that he's gonna. How did he put that? You're going to struggle to extract a living from the ground. So
life is going to be worse for him.
He's cursing Adam, actually, because he won't be able to get his...
Well, I think the reason why people like to make the distinction and say that is because the story seems somewhat intentional. It says he cursed the serpent, he cursed the ground, and yes, there are these bad consequences for man and woman, clearly. But it seems possible, if not plausible, to say God is still protecting Adam and Eve. He's still not outright cursing them. He is giving them the consequences. He's judging their actions. But he is not cursing them in and of themselves. Now, that could just be semantics. That could just be trying to explain it away so God doesn't sound as mean. I don't know. Because it's clear that life gets harder for both of them. First of all, the woman, he says, I'm going to multiply your pain in childbearing, which is already things are being turned on their head. Originally, they were blessed to be fruitful and multiply. Here, the multiplication is of pain. It's not good. And we're at time, so I'll try and finish real quickly.
At one point, I heard someone say that that many Jewish people look at that passage about the pain in bringing forth children, and they don't really think about labor pain as much as pain in raising children, bringing them forth to adulthood. That being a mother is hard.
Right. I heard this for the first time in my life this last week, and I don't know if I'm fully settled on it, but it makes a lot of sense. Is that actually, and this is always kind of frustrating when scholars do this. They'll say, well, actually in the Hebrew it means this. And you're like, well, there's like 40 translations that say this. So what are you doing? Like trying to retranslate this. But there's legitimate issues every now and then people realize, actually, no, I think we've had this bad tradition of translation. We got to fix this problem here. But I heard recently that actually what it's pointing to is that from now on, kind of the conditions of conception, it's actually referring less to childbearing or child rearing in this interpretation I heard, and more about conception. And it's not so much even really talking about like the act of sexual intimacy, as it's talking about like from now on, your intimate relationships will be marked by pain. And the reason why that makes a lot of sense to me is because that explains a lot of Genesis. Because in the stories of all the different men and women in Genesis who come together and get married and have children, there's like, I think one story of a woman having so much pain in childbirth that she dies. And it's Rebecca. Well, it's Jacob's wife. And I think Rebecca was Isaac's. It's Rachel, thank you. Rachel, with their last child, with Benjamin, she dies because the pains are so bad. But most of the stories in Genesis are about couples making bad decisions, hurting each other, causing strife between each other, having multiple wives, and then those wives fighting with each other. It's like one bad relationship, dysfunctional relationship after the other that causes a lot of pain. So again, I'm no expert. I can't tell you. I haven't studied these Hebrew terms in detail. But whatever the case may be, the consequence for women and humanity is more pain. And also what this implies about work is that work was originally meant to be easy. Like after this point, the ground is cursed and now all of this work is going to... So I think every farmer who reads this should think, oh man, what would it be like if every time I just planted a seed...
Wouldn't eat that apple.
Exactly. Right. There wouldn't have been weeds and it just would have popped out of the
No
ground
thistles,
and
no nothing.
and it would have just been beautiful and bore a lot of fruit, and so actually in the new creation, the image isn't, oh, Super Bowl time, I got to finish. So the image is not that in the new creation we're all going to be laying in hammocks and we're just going to be like eating grapes. No, we're going to be doing work, but it won't be sweat, laborious, frustrating work. It'll be joyful doing work with Jesus in his new creation and just ruling with him over creation. Okay.
Don't worry about the input, John.
Huh? No.
Don't have to worry about the input, John.
No.
Shouldn't it be joyous work now?
Well,
Working with Jesus?
but this is also about the already not yet that we talked about earlier. Because of Jesus, we can experience work as joyful now. And we do believe in some sense, not in a prosperity gospel sense, like if you love Jesus, you're going to be rich. But we do believe that sometimes God does bless us in ways that things are abundant that shouldn't always be abundant. You hear stories every now and then about someone who's like, you know what, I just went ahead and tithed even though I didn't have the money, and then I found myself, I was okay. Like, it didn't break the bank. And all of a sudden, things stretched further that weren't supposed to stretch further. And I looked back at my bank account and think, you hear those stories every now and then. And it's not a story of like, if you love Jesus, you're going to get a jumbo jet. It's a story of, if you love Jesus, he will take care of you. And you'll have the food you need and the shelter you need and the clothing you need. So, well, let me say a short prayer.